The text message that shattered 23 years of devotion contained exactly 19 words, and my son sent it at 11:47 on a Tuesday night like it was nothing more than a grocery list. Mom, the investor gala is black tie and very formal. It's really not your scene. I'll have someone live stream it for you. I read it 3 times sitting at my kitchen table in Hartwell, Tennessee, still in my nursing scrubs, still smelling like the hospital where I had worked double shifts for the better part of 2 decades to give my son every single thing I never had growing up. 19 words. That's all it took to make me feel like the dirty secret he had always been ashamed to claim. My name is Margaret Calloway, but everyone who matters to me calls me Maggie. I am 64 years old, and for most of those years, I have been defined by one thing above all others, being my son Derek's mother. His father left when Derek was 3, drove his truck south toward Florida one morning and never came back. And from that day forward, it was just the 2 of us in a small house on Birchwood Lane in Hartwell, a town so small the post office and the barber shop shared a parking lot. I worked nights at Ridgewood Regional Medical Center as an emergency room nurse, which meant I spent years surviving on 4 hours of sleep and cold coffee while making sure Derek had clean clothes, hot breakfast, and a mother who showed up to every single school play, every baseball game, every parent-teacher conference, no matter how exhausted I was. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and I made sure he never felt the weight of what we lacked. When the other kids in his class wore name-brand sneakers, I found ways. When his science fair project needed supplies I couldn't afford, I picked up extra weekend shifts at the urgent care clinic across town. When he got accepted to Vanderbilt University on a partial scholarship, I refinanced the house I had spent 15 years paying down and took out every loan available to me so he could walk through those doors without owing his future to a mountain of debt. He studied business and finance, graduated with honors, and moved to Nashville at 22 with big ideas and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having had to question whether you deserved a seat at the table. I was so proud of him I could barely speak at his graduation ceremony. This was everything I had worked for, everything I had stayed up nights praying about. My boy, standing in the world with his whole life spread out before him like a banquet. The changes started slowly, the way a tide pulls sand gradual enough that you don't notice how much has disappeared until you look down and find yourself standing on bare rock. The first time Derek corrected my grammar on the phone, I laughed it off. "Mom, it's he and I, not him and me." He said it gently enough, but something in the delivery felt like a door closing. Then came the visits that stopped happening, replaced by phone calls that got shorter and more transactional. Then the time I drove up to Nashville to surprise him for his birthday, and he met me in the lobby of his apartment building, never invited me upstairs, and spent exactly 45 minutes with me before announcing he had a work dinner. His work dinner, I later found out from a mutual acquaintance, was with people from his building whom he had known for years. He simply hadn't wanted me to come up. By the time he was 31, Derek had built himself a financial consulting firm called Callaway Capital Group, which I always thought was funny because he had spent so much energy trying to erase the Callaway in him that named the company felt like an afterthought. The firm was doing well, or at least that's what he told me. He had clients with money, connections in real estate, and a social circle that ran in circles I had never traveled. He had also, somewhere along the way, developed a version of his own origin story that I was not a part of. I found out the first time a colleague of his called my house looking for him. She introduced herself as Priya, his business partner's wife, and mentioned in passing that she had always admired Derek for being self-made. He told us he was raised mostly by his grandparents after his parents split, she said brightly, that he really had to figure things out on his own. I told her that sounded like an interesting story, gave her Derek's cell number, and sat down on my kitchen floor when I hung up the phone. His grandparents. My mother had passed when Derek was 7. His grandfather, my father, had Alzheimer's by the time Derek started middle school. Neither of them had raised him a single day. I had raised him, alone, on a nurse's salary and stubbornness and love so deep it had no floor. When I confronted him about it later, he sighed the way he always did when he found my feelings inconvenient. "Mom, people in my world have certain expectations. They want to know that the person managing their money has a foundation they can trust. And what's wrong with my foundation? You work in an emergency room in a town with one stoplight. These clients have portfolios worth more than that entire town. It's just optics. Optics. 23 years of sacrifice reduced to a bad visual. I should have seen what was coming. But when you love someone with the particular blindness of a mother, you keep finding explanations. He's stressed about the business. He's navigating a new world. He'll find his way back. I kept the door open so long that I didn't notice he had stopped even standing near it. The gala was for the official 5-year anniversary of Callaway Capital Group. Derek had been talking about it for months. The venue, the guest list, the keynote speaker he had hired, the press coverage he had arranged. He mentioned it in every phone call, the way people mention things they are deeply proud of, but also vaguely want to rub in your face. 400 guests. Nashville's Riverfront Grand Hotel, the kind of event that gets written up in the business section of the Tennessean, and 19 words in a text message at midnight to tell me it wasn't my scene. I called him the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring with the particular brand of patience that meant he had already decided how the conversation would go. Mom, it's a professional event. These are investors, board members, people with serious money. It would just be complicated. Complicated how, Derek? Having your mother there. You'd be uncomfortable. You wouldn't know anyone. Are you telling me I'd embarrass you? I'm telling you it's not the right environment. I asked him one more question. Derek, how many guests are you expecting? 400, give or take. He paused when I said it back to him. So there's room for 400 people, but not for the woman who remortgaged her house so you could get your degree. Another pause. I'll have the Livestream link sent to you before it starts. He hung up, and I stared at the phone for a long moment before I did something I had never done in 31 years of mothering him. I opened my laptop and requested a copy of my credit report. What I found over the next 4 days changed everything I thought I understood about the man my son had become. The credit monitoring service put me on hold for 11 minutes before a woman came on the line and began reading me a list of accounts I had never opened. 7 of them. 3 business credit lines, 2 personal cards, and 2 accounts I couldn't immediately identify that had been opened in the past 18 months using my social security number, my date of birth, and my home address. The combined credit limit across all 7 accounts was just over $200,000. The combined balance was $163,000. I sat very still while she read the figures. Then I asked her to repeat them. The charges told a story I did not want to believe. Event planning companies in Nashville, a commercial catering service, audio and lighting rental, a luxury car service, hotel deposits at the Riverfront Grand. My son had been funding the 5-year anniversary gala of his company using credit accounts opened in my name without my knowledge or consent. He was throwing a 400-person black tie party for himself, and I was paying for it without ever having been told. The property records took another day to unravel. A title company in Nashville called my cell while I was at work, asking to confirm a detail on a home equity line of credit taken out against my Birchwood Lane property 6 months earlier. I had not applied for any such line of credit. The loan was for $80,000. The funds had been wired to an account belonging to Callaway Capital Group. He had used my house, the house I had worked nights for 15 years to nearly pay off, the house I had refinanced to put him through Vanderbilt as collateral for a business loan he never told me about. He had forged my signature. He had borrowed against the roof over my head to fund his firm, and then he had sent me 19 words telling me to watch from home. I sat in the parking lot of Ridgewood Regional that night after my shift and cried for about 10 minutes. Then I dried my face, drove home, and made a list. I need to pause here and tell you something I found out the same week all of this came to light, because it matters for understanding what came next. I had been putting off a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist for 2 months because I kept picking up extra shifts and telling myself I'd reschedule. When I finally went in, she sat me down with the kind of careful posture that doctors use when the news requires a chair. Congestive heart failure, early stage. Manageable with medication and lifestyle changes, but serious enough that she used the word urgent twice in the same sentence. I drove home and sat in my kitchen thinking about the fact that my son didn't know I had a heart condition, not because I had hidden it, but because he had stopped asking about my life long enough ago that there was nothing to hide. He simply never asked. That was the moment something shifted in me from grief into something cleaner, not rage, just clarity. I made 4 phone calls that evening. The first was to my oldest friend, Connie Bratcher, who had worked beside me in that ER for 19 years, and who, when I told her what I had discovered, said absolutely nothing for about 8 seconds, and then said, "Tell me what time and where." The second call was to Pastor Gerald Odom from Mount Zion Church in Hartwell, who had baptized Derek at age 9 and who knew our whole story from the ground up. The third call was to Leonard Marsh, a retired attorney who lived 3 houses down and had helped me navigate the paperwork when I refinanced the house years ago, meaning he had copies of the original documents and knew exactly what my legitimate signatures looked like. The fourth call was to Derek's former college roommate, a man named Calvin Tate, who had stayed close to our family over the years, and who, when I reached him, admitted quietly that he had been aware of some of what Derek had been saying about his background and had been uncomfortable with it for a long time. "I'm in," he said. "He needs to hear this. I did not call the police. I want to be very clear about that choice. I had grounds to. What Derek had done was not a misunderstanding or a gray area. It was fraud. It was forgery. It was identity theft carried out by my own child against me. But I had spent 31 years being his mother, and whatever he had become, whatever shame or ambition had hollowed him out and replaced the boy I raised with someone I barely recognized, I was not ready to hand him to a prosecutor. Not yet. First, I needed him to see himself the way I was seeing him. I contacted the event venue directly, explaining that I was Derek Calloway's mother and that I needed to add guests to the family table. The coordinator was warm and efficient and added 5 names without a single question. I also asked her, in passing, how the event was shaping up. She told me it was going to be one of the most elegant evenings they had hosted all year. 400 guests, a full dinner service, a keynote address by a nationally recognized financial commentator, and a very excited host who had been calling her office every other day for 3 months. I thanked her and told her I was very much looking forward to it. The morning of the gala, I got dressed in my good navy pantsuit, the one I had bought for Derek's college graduation and worn exactly twice since then because I never seemed to have occasion for it. I pinned my mother's brooch to the lapel, a small gold magnolia she had given me when I graduated nursing school. Then I drove to Connie's house, picked her up, drove to Leonard's, picked him up along with his briefcase and 2 manila envelopes I had asked him to prepare, and we were on the road to Nashville by 3 in the afternoon. Pastor Odom met us at the hotel lobby at 6:30. Calvin was already there, waiting near the entrance in a dark suit, looking like he hadn't slept well. He hugged me before I said a word. "You okay, Miss Maggie?" I told him I was fine, I just needed to attend my son's party. The event was already in motion when we walked in. The lobby of the Riverfront Grand was all chandeliers and champagne flutes, and people in expensive clothes congratulating each other on things I would never fully understand. I could see through the open ballroom doors a room full of round tables draped in white linen, a stage at the far end where Derek would presumably speak later, and a banner across the back wall that read, "Callaway Capital Group, 5 years of building what others said was impossible." What others said was impossible. I had said his dream was possible approximately 10,000 times over the course of his life. I had made it possible in ways that were now being described as his alone. We found our seats at a table near the center of the room, and for about 20 minutes nothing happened except that people ate their salads and made conversation, and the string quartet played something I didn't recognize. Then Derek appeared from a side entrance, working the room the way he always had, shaking hands, throwing his head back to laugh at things that probably weren't that funny. He looked polished and confident, and exactly like what he had worked so hard to become. He didn't see me until he was about halfway across the room. I watched the moment register on his face. The smile held for about 2 seconds on sheer muscle memory before something underneath it gave way. He excused himself from the people he was with and walked toward me at a pace that was trying very hard to look unhurried and was not succeeding. "Mom," he said it quietly, his jaw tight. "What are you doing here?" I smiled up at him from my chair. "I came to celebrate your 5 years, sweetheart. I wouldn't miss it." He leaned down just slightly. "I told you this wasn't the right environment. I replied that the venue coordinator had been very accommodating when I added our names to the family table. His eyes moved to Connie, to Leonard with his briefcase, to Pastor Odom, to Calvin. I could see him recalculating. We need to talk somewhere private. I looked at the room full of people who had invested money in his firm and trusted his word. I think here is fine, I said. I think we've had enough private conversations. He straightened up. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. Before he could speak, a man approached us, older, silver-haired, the kind of careful tan that comes from actual vacations rather than a booth, and extended his hand to Derek with the familiarity of someone who had written a significant check. Derek, wonderful evening. Is this your family? Derek hesitated for just a moment too long. And in that moment, I stood up and extended my own hand. I'm Margaret Calloway, I said. Derek's mother. He told me once that I raised him, but I want to clarify that I actually raised him quite a bit more than that. The silver-haired man, his name was Robert Hensley, one of Derek's original investors, as it turned out, looked between the two of us with the expression of someone who has walked into a room and sensed immediately that the temperature is not what it should be. Well, he said carefully, it's a pleasure to meet you. He told me Derek spoke so highly of his self-made journey. I told him that was interesting, because I thought I was a fairly significant part of that journey. Then I mentioned that Leonard beside me was a retired attorney who had brought some documents that might be relevant to some of the investors present, and I asked whether Robert thought the keynote portion of the evening might have room for a brief addition to the program. Robert Hensley had the instincts of a man who had spent decades reading rooms. He looked at Leonard's briefcase. He looked at my face. He said, "Why don't we find Derek's business partner?" And then things moved very quickly. I will not pretend the next 40 minutes were clean or comfortable. They were not. They happened in stages, the way a building comes apart, not all at once, but in a sequence where each thing that falls makes the next thing inevitable. Derek's business partner, a man named Anthony Weir, who had apparently been kept as much in the dark as everyone else, went pale when Leonard opened the first envelope and began walking him through the loan documents with the forged signatures. He went paler still when the credit report came out. 7 accounts in my name with $160,000 in charges, the largest cluster of which tracked almost exactly to the vendors contracted for the evening we were all currently attending. Derek tried several approaches in rapid succession. He told Anthony there was an explanation. He told Robert the documents were being taken out of context. He told me, with something in his voice that I hadn't heard since he was a child caught in a lie, that we should talk about this as a family. I told him that I had tried to talk to him as a family for several years and found the access limited, so we would handle it here. Calvin spoke then, and I think his voice hit Derek harder than anything else that evening, because Calvin had no stake in it except honesty. "Derek," he said quietly, "I've heard you tell people your mother was a distant figure who wasn't around much. I've heard you tell people you came from nothing and built everything yourself. I was in your dorm room in our sophomore year when your mom called at midnight because she wanted to make sure you had eaten. I think the people in this room deserve to know which version of you they've actually been investing in." Pastor Odom did not raise his voice. He never has to. He simply said that he had known this family for over 20 years, that he had watched me work nights and weekends to keep Derek's future funded, and that the only thing more impressive than what Derek had built was the woman who had built the foundation he was standing on. Connie put her hand on my arm while all of this unfolded, steady as she has always been. Robert Hensley asked Derek a single question, the question that seemed to settle something in the room. "Did you use your mother's assets as collateral for business loans without her knowledge?" Derek did not answer immediately. In the silence, Leonard opened the second envelope and placed the title documents on the table. My son looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Mom, I let him get that far, and then I said something I had been sitting with for 4 days. You told them you were self-made. You told them your mother wasn't part of the story. You told them you figured it out on your own. And then you used my name, my credit, and my house to fund the night where you planned to tell that story to 400 people. I need you to understand that I know all of this, and I came here tonight not to destroy you, but because I need you to see what you've actually done." He sat down. He sat down in one of those white linen chairs in the middle of his own gala, with 400 guests on the other side of the curtained partition, and he put his face in his hands. Anthony Weir excused himself to make a phone call. Robert Hensley stayed. He looked at me with an expression I did not entirely expect, which was something close to respect. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'm very sorry you're dealing with this." I thanked him. I told him I was also dealing with a heart condition I had just been diagnosed with, and that my son hadn't known about it because we had not been close enough for him to know, and that I was telling him now not for sympathy but because I wanted him to understand the full picture of what I had driven 3 hours to say. Derek looked up when I said that. He looked at me the way he had not looked at me in years, not with the polished detachment of the man he had constructed, but with something rawer underneath it. "You have a heart condition?" I told him yes. I told him it was manageable. I told him I had driven here anyway because some things matter more than taking it easy. The gala proceeded, eventually. Not as Derek had planned it. The keynote happened, the dinner happened, but the mood was different, quieter, and Derek's speech, which I was told later had been extensively prepared, was shorter and less triumphant than he had intended. Anthony Weir spent much of the evening in conversations that did not look celebratory. Several guests left early. Leonard had already contacted the bank holding the fraudulent home equity loan before we came, and the process of unwinding it had begun. The credit accounts were another matter, months of paperwork, dispute filings, and documentation, but Leonard was confident we could restore everything without criminal proceedings if Derek cooperated fully, which he had already agreed, in writing, before the evening ended, to do. We drove home to Hartwell that night, the 5 of us, stopping at a Cracker Barrel off the interstate because Pastor Odom said he couldn't ride 3 hours without pie. We sat in a booth under fluorescent lights and ate pecan pie and talked about everything and nothing, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been loose and rattling around for the better part of a year. Connie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I told her. "But right, like something true got said that needed saying." The weeks after that night were not easy, but they were honest in a way that everything preceding them had not been. The financial unraveling took time and paperwork, and 2 more meetings with Leonard before it was fully addressed. My credit was restored over the course of about 4 months. The home equity loan was voided, and the lien on my house removed. Derek signed every document placed in front of him without argument, which I took not as contrition exactly, but as the beginning of it. He called me 6 weeks after the gala. It was the first time he had called me, not responded to a call of mine, in longer than I could easily remember. He asked how I was feeling. I told him the medication was helping and the cardiologist was cautiously optimistic. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I didn't know you were sick, Mom." I told him that was true and that it was also a choice he had made, even if he hadn't realized he was making it. What he said next was not an excuse, and I want to give him credit for that. He said he had spent so long being ashamed of where we came from, ashamed of the small town, the nursing scrubs, the refinanced house, the way I pronounced certain words, all the markers of a life that didn't match the image he was trying to project, that he had convinced himself erasing me was a kind of self-preservation. And then the erasing had required lies, and the lies had required maintenance, and somewhere in the maintenance he had crossed lines he couldn't uncross while telling himself they were just practical decisions. I asked him when he had started being ashamed of Hartwell. He thought about it for a long time, probably around the time I realized how hard you were working to get me out of it. I think I decided if I had to get out, it meant there was something wrong with it. With us. With you. So your solution was to pretend I didn't exist. I know how that sounds. I told him it sounded like something a person says before they decide to do better or not. The choice was still his. I did not throw my arms open immediately, and I did not close the door permanently. I told him that trust was not a switch that got flipped, that what he had done had real consequences beyond the financial ones, and that the path back to being my son, my actual son, not the version of him that used me when convenient and buried me when inconvenient, was going to require sustained effort over time, not a single phone call. He said he understood. He said he had started seeing a therapist, which I thought was probably the most useful thing I'd heard him say in years. He said Calvin had been talking to him. He said he was trying to figure out who he was without the constructed version, which sounded painful, and I told him it probably would be, and that painful things were sometimes the ones worth going through. 3 months after the gala, he drove to Hartwell for the first time in 4 years. He showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with groceries and no grand speech, and we cooked lunch together in my kitchen on Birchwood Lane, the way we used to when he was in high school. He didn't try to fix everything in one afternoon. He just showed up. I showed him the magnolia in the backyard that I had planted the year he started kindergarten, the one I had told him would be tall enough to climb by the time he was 10. He had climbed it exactly once, and then decided it wasn't as interesting as he'd hoped. We stood next to it that afternoon, both taller than we had been when the story of us started, and I thought about all the ways love persists past the people we become when we forget who taught us to become them. I still go to work at Ridgewood Regional 3 days a week. My cardiologist has me on a modified schedule, and Connie makes sure I don't push past it. Pastor Odom's congregation sent me a card after the story made its way around Hartwell the way all stories eventually do, in a town with one stoplight. Leonard framed the document showing the lien on my house had been cleared and brought it to me in person. I am 64 years old, and I have a small house on Birchwood Lane, and a heart that is working harder than it should, and a son who is learning, slowly, the difference between building something real and building something that looks real from the outside. Those are very different structures. One of them lasts. Someone told me recently that what I did at that gala was brave. I've thought about that word, and I don't think it fits exactly. Brave suggests I wasn't afraid. I was afraid. I was afraid of losing him entirely. Afraid of what it would mean if I stood up and he chose the lie anyway. Afraid of being 64 with a heart condition and no family worth the name. What I was something other than brave. I was just done pretending that love means accepting any version of treatment someone decides to hand you. If you have ever kept your mouth shut because you were afraid the truth would cost you the relationship, I want you to hear this. Silence doesn't protect the relationship. It just delays the reckoning. And the reckoning comes either way. The only question is whether you're standing up when it does or still sitting by the phone waiting for a live stream link. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit that like button if you've ever had to remind someone that you are not a chapter they get to skip. Because I promise you the people worth keeping will not ask you to.